Some nights don't change your life. They decide whether you deserve to keep it. The wind howled across the frozen highway like a living thing, swallowing every sound except one, the desperate cry of a woman who refused to let her unborn child die. Donovan stumbled through waist-deep snow, one trembling hand wrapped around her swollen 8-month belly, while the other reached into the darkness for a miracle that never came. Her blonde hair, once carefully brushed before what Ethan had promised would be a romantic anniversary getaway, was now stiff with ice. Blood trickled down her leg, staining the untouched snow crimson behind every unsteady step. Each footprint looked like a silent countdown toward death. 20 minutes earlier, the black Rolls-Royce had disappeared into the white storm without its headlights ever flashing back. Ethan Caldwell hadn't even looked in the rearview mirror. He had lowered the passenger window just enough to let the freezing wind rush inside before saying, in the same calm voice he used during board meetings, "You'll only slow me down now." Then he drove away. Claire had watched the taillights vanish until the blizzard swallowed them whole. At first she thought he would come back. Husbands came back. Fathers came back. Men who once whispered forever beside a wedding altar came back. But the silence stretched longer than hope itself. Another contraction ripped through her body with terrifying force. She collapsed onto one knee, gasping as pain radiated through her abdomen. The baby kicked frantically, as though sensing every ounce of panic flooding her bloodstream. "Stay with me," Claire whispered through chattering teeth, pressing both hands over her belly. "Please, just stay with Mommy." The words disappeared into the wind before they reached anyone else. Snowflakes landed across her eyelashes, melting into tears she no longer noticed. Around her, the mountains stood like frozen giants, indifferent witnesses to a crime no courtroom had yet discovered. The road was empty. No headlights. No voices. No houses. Only endless white stretching beneath a sky as black as wet ink. Her phone battery had died almost an hour earlier. The signal disappeared even before that. Every survival instinct screamed at her to keep moving, but another contraction bent her forward until she screamed into the storm. Somewhere beneath layers of fear, she realized the truth her mind had tried to deny. Her baby wasn't waiting for a hospital anymore. The baby was coming now. Claire looked around wildly for shelter and spotted a shallow snowbank beside a rusted highway barrier. It wasn't safety. It was simply the only place left. She dragged herself toward it inch by painful inch. The cold burned her lungs with every breath. Her vision blurred. She wrapped her coat beneath her body, fighting to shield the tiny life inside her from the frozen ground. Then, through the roar of the blizzard, another sound emerged. Low, heavy, rhythmic. Not thunder, not wind. An engine. Far beyond the curtain of snow, two amber lights slowly appeared, cutting through the darkness like watchful eyes. Claire couldn't know it yet, but the man behind that weathered 18-wheeler was the last person Ethan Caldwell had ever hoped would find her alive. 2 hours earlier, Donovan had believed she was driving toward a second chance. The snow hadn't started yet. Gray clouds floated above the mountains like silent warnings, but Ethan Caldwell smiled as he opened the passenger door of his black Rolls-Royce. It was the first genuine smile she had seen from her husband in weeks. "Happy anniversary," he had said, holding out a bouquet of white lilies. They were her favorite flowers, or at least they used to be before they became funeral flowers in her mind. Claire smiled anyway. At 8 months pregnant, hope came easier than suspicion. She settled carefully into the leather seat, one hand resting over the gentle curve of her belly as their daughter shifted beneath her coat. "She likes road trips," Claire laughed softly after feeling a tiny kick. Ethan started the engine without answering. Classical piano drifted through the speakers while the city skyline disappeared behind them. For nearly an hour, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was practiced. The kind of silence built from hundreds of unfinished conversations and thousands of swallowed disappointments. Claire watched snow begin to dust the pine trees outside the window. "I thought we were going to dinner," she finally said. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "Plans change." His voice was calm. Too calm. She studied his reflection in the windshield. The expensive watch on his wrist. The wedding ring he still wore. The jaw that remained perfectly relaxed. Months ago, she would have reached for his hand. Today she simply folded her fingers together and stared ahead. Her phone buzzed once. A message from her obstetrician reminding her about tomorrow's appointment. Before she could reply, Ethan reached across the console. There's no signal up here. Save the battery. He turned her phone completely off and placed it inside the glove compartment. Claire frowned, but said nothing. He had become strangely controlling since the pregnancy. He insisted on choosing her clothes, her doctors, even the food she ate. Every disagreement ended the same way. I'm doing this for our family. She wanted to believe him. Desperately. The road narrowed as they climbed higher into the mountains. Snow began falling harder, covering the pavement in fresh white layers. Ethan finally pulled the car onto a deserted scenic overlook surrounded by towering pines. There were no other vehicles. No cabins. No lights. Only endless wilderness disappearing beneath the gathering storm. Why are we stopping? Claire asked quietly. Ethan turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt louder than the wind outside. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. Claire, have you ever wondered why successful men leave their wives? The question settled between them like ice. She forced a smile that never reached her eyes. Is this some kind of joke? No. He unbuckled his seatbelt. It's because they outgrow them. Claire stared at him, unable to breathe. Ethan, you've become exactly what I was afraid of. He glanced briefly toward her swollen belly. Predictable. Emotional. Heavy. Every word landed with surgical precision. I built an empire while you stayed home decorating nurseries. Tears blurred Claire's vision. I'm carrying your daughter. Exactly. His expression never changed. And she's the only reason I waited this long. He stepped out of the car, walked around to her side, and opened the passenger door. The freezing wind exploded into the cabin. Snow whipped across Claire's face as she instinctively shielded her stomach. Get out, Ethan said. She looked at him in disbelief. You're not serious. He met her eyes with terrifying indifference. I have been serious for months. Claire climbed out slowly, believing, hoping, that this was some cruel argument that would end in apology. Instead, Ethan climbed back behind the wheel, locked the doors, lowered the driver's window by only a few inches, and delivered the sentence that would haunt every nightmare she would ever have. You'll only slow me down now. Then the Rolls-Royce accelerated into the falling snow, leaving Claire standing completely alone as the first painful contraction stole the air from her lungs. The first scream vanished into the blizzard before anyone could hear it. Claire Donovan curled against the snow-covered embankment, every muscle in her body trembling as another contraction tore through her with breathtaking force. Tom no longer existed. There was only pain, then a few desperate breaths, then more pain. Her fingers had gone so numb she could barely feel the tiny silver necklace hanging beneath her coat, the anniversary gift Ethan had given her 3 years earlier. Somehow it still rested against her chest while the man who bought it had abandoned her to die. No, she whispered through clenched teeth. Not here. Please, not here. Her voice cracked as freezing air burned her lungs. She looked toward the empty highway one more time, praying to see the black Rolls-Royce returning through the storm. Nothing. Only swirling white. The realization settled over her like another layer of ice. No one was coming. Her body had already decided. The baby would be born on this frozen mountainside. Claire fought against panic the way she'd practiced in childbirth classes. Inhale. Hold. Exhale. Again. But every breathing exercise she'd learned assumed warm hospital lights, experienced nurses, and Ethan holding her hand. Instead, there was darkness. Wind. Snow. Silence. A violent contraction bent her forward until she cried out. She felt warmth spreading beneath her despite the freezing temperature. Her water had broken. Tears streamed down her face, instantly freezing against her cheeks. Baby, listen to mommy, she whispered, placing both trembling hands over her belly. We're going to do this together. The words sounded impossible even as she spoke them. Minutes blurred together. She managed to spread her heavy winter coat beneath her body to create the smallest barrier against the frozen ground. Every movement drained what little strength she had left. Her vision flickered. Black spots danced across the endless white landscape. She wondered if this was how people disappeared forever, quietly, unnoticed, erased by falling snow before sunrise. Another contraction came harder than the last. Claire screamed until her throat felt raw. Then she pushed. Instinct replaced fear. Her body remembered what her mind could no longer process. She pushed again. The wind roared louder. almost as though the mountain itself was holding its breath. Then a sound. Soft. Fragile. Almost impossible. A tiny cry. Claire's heart stopped before racing wildly inside her chest. She reached forward with shaking hands and lifted the slippery newborn against her body. The baby girl was frighteningly small, her skin flushed red from the cold, but she was alive. Crying. Fighting. Breathing. Claire sobbed harder than she had at her wedding. Harder than the day she first saw 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test. "You're here," she whispered over and over, wrapping the infant inside her own sweater beneath her coat. "You're here. You're alive." She pressed the baby against her bare skin, remembering something the nurse had once taught her during prenatal classes. Skin-to-skin contact. Keep the baby warm. Keep her breathing. Claire wrapped both arms around her daughter as tightly as exhaustion allowed. The umbilical cord still connected them, but she no longer cared about blood or pain or the freezing wind cutting across her back. The only thing that mattered was the tiny heartbeat fluttering against her chest. The storm continued without mercy. Snow settled across Claire's shoulders, her hair, the baby's blanket, slowly covering them both in white. Her eyelids grew heavier with every passing second. She fought to keep them open, whispering lullabies her mother had once sung to her as a child. Then, somewhere beyond the howl of the wind, another sound reached her. Deep, mechanical, steady. A diesel engine climbing the mountain road. The amber glow of enormous headlights slowly pierced the blizzard, growing brighter with every heartbeat. While somewhere behind that windshield, a stranger was about to make a decision that would change all 3 of their lives forever. The truck's air brakes hissed through the blizzard like a giant taking its first breath. Logan Hayes frowned as the beam of his headlights swept across the empty highway. He had driven this mountain route hundreds of times over the years. Snowdrifts, fallen branches, stranded cars. He had seen them all. But blood on fresh snow? Never. A narrow crimson trail cut across the shoulder before disappearing toward the embankment. Logan's hands tightened around the steering wheel. Every instinct he had learned during 6 years in the Army whispered the same warning. Something was terribly wrong. He eased the 18-wheeler onto the shoulder, flipped on the hazard lights, grabbed the emergency medical bag he always kept behind the driver's seat, and stepped into the storm. The wind slammed against him with enough force to steal his breath. Snow stung his face as he followed the scattered drops of blood. One step, then another. "Hello," he shouted. "Can anyone hear me?" Only the wind answered. Then, barely visible beneath a blanket of drifting snow, he spotted what looked like the sleeve of a winter coat. Logan broke into a run. His boots sank deep into the snow as he dropped to one knee beside the motionless figure. A young woman, blonde hair frozen into pale strands across her face. Lips turning blue, arms wrapped tightly around something beneath her coat. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" No response. He brushed snow away from her shoulders and suddenly heard it. A tiny, trembling cry. Logan froze for half a heartbeat before carefully opening the edge of the woman's coat. Nestled against her chest was a newborn baby, no more than a few minutes old, her tiny fists trembling as she fought the freezing air. Logan's pulse surged. "Oh God," he whispered. "You actually did it." Claire's eyelids fluttered weakly. Her cracked lips moved almost soundlessly. "My baby." Logan leaned closer. "She's alive," he said firmly. "And so are you. Stay with me." Training took over. Calm replaced shock. He removed his insulated jacket without hesitation and wrapped it around the infant before lifting the baby gently against his own chest for a moment to shield her from the wind. Then he slid both mother and daughter onto a thermal emergency blanket. Claire tried to resist, clutching the baby with surprising strength. "I won't let anyone take her," she murmured. Logan met her frightened eyes. "Neither will I." Those 4 words were enough. Claire's fingers slowly relaxed. Within seconds, he carried both of them toward the truck, shielding them with his body against the storm. The warm blast from the cab heater hit like sunlight as he climbed inside. Logan locked the doors, increased the heat, and immediately radioed for emergency assistance, but static swallowed every transmission. No signal. The mountain storm had knocked out communications again. He looked through the windshield at the endless curtain of snow. Waiting wasn't an option. The nearest hospital was still more than 40 miles away. He quickly clamped the umbilical cord using supplies from his trauma kit, wrapped the baby in clean thermal blankets, and checked Claire's pulse. Weak, but steady. The newborn's tiny cry grew louder inside the heated cab, filling the silence with the unmistakable sound of survival. Logan finally exhaled. Then his eyes drifted to the polished chrome emblem mounted in the center of the steering wheel. It wasn't the logo of an ordinary trucking company. It belonged to Hayes Global Logistics, the multi-billion-dollar transportation empire known across the country. Few people knew its founder still drove one of his own trucks through the mountains several nights each month. Fewer still knew there was only one name capable of turning that quiet billionaire into a dangerous man: Ethan Caldwell. And as Logan stared at the exhausted mother sleeping beside her newborn daughter, a memory from 10 years earlier surfaced like a ghost in the storm. He knew that name far better than anyone imagined. By the time the truck reached the emergency entrance of Pine Valley Medical Center, dawn was beginning to stain the eastern sky with pale blue light. Nurses rushed Claire Donovan and her newborn daughter through the sliding doors while Logan Hayes remained beside the stretcher until the medical team physically guided him back. "We'll take it from here," one doctor assured him. Logan nodded, but his eyes never left the exhausted young mother disappearing down the hallway. For some reason he couldn't explain, walking away felt impossible. An hour later, he sat alone in the hospital cafeteria with an untouched cup of black coffee growing cold between his hands. Snow still drifted outside the windows. His clothes were damp. His knuckles were scratched from digging Claire out of the frozen embankment. Yet none of it occupied his thoughts. Instead, one name echoed inside his mind with increasing clarity: Ethan Caldwell. Logan hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in nearly 10 years, but some enemies never truly disappear. They simply wait beneath old scars. A decade earlier, Logan had been nothing more than the owner of a small regional trucking company with 40 employees and a dream larger than his balance sheet. His father had built those trucks one payment at a time. Every driver knew one another's children. Every customer mattered. Then Ethan Caldwell arrived. Young, brilliant, ruthless. Ethan's real estate empire needed thousands of acres surrounding several freight corridors. Logan had refused to sell his family's land. 2 months later, anonymous complaints appeared. Contracts vanished overnight. Banks suddenly withdrew financing. Suppliers demanded immediate payment. By the end of that year, Logan's company had collapsed beneath debts it never should have carried. Newspapers called it bad business. Logan knew better. He had watched too many signatures disappear after meetings with Ethan Caldwell. Friends advised him to sue. Others begged him to retaliate. Logan chose something far more difficult. He walked away, starting over with a single second-hand truck and a promise to himself that he would never build success by destroying another family. 10 years later, Hayes Global Logistics had become one of the largest transportation companies in North America. Ironically, the same competitors who once laughed at him now asked for partnership agreements. Logan rarely accepted. Wealth had changed his circumstances, not his habits. He still drove long-haul routes several nights each month because it reminded him where everything had begun. It also reminded thousands of employees that no job inside the company was beneath its founder. His thoughts broke as a nurse approached his table carrying a folded hospital blanket. "Mr. Hayes?" Logan looked up in surprise. "She's awake." He stood immediately. "How's the baby?" The nurse smiled for the first time that morning. "Healthy, cold, but incredibly strong." Relief washed across Logan's face. "And the mother?" "She's asking for the man who found her." Minutes later, Logan stepped quietly into Claire's hospital room. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds. The newborn slept peacefully in a clear bassinet beside the bed, wrapped in fresh blankets. Claire looked impossibly fragile against the white pillow, but her blue eyes opened the moment he entered. "You stayed," she whispered. Logan offered a gentle smile. "Someone had to make sure you both won your first fight." Tears filled Claire's eyes. "I don't even know your name." "Logan Hayes." She repeated it softly, almost as though committing it to memory forever. Then her expression changed. Fear replaced gratitude. "He'll come back," she said. "If Ethan learns we're alive, he won't stop." Logan followed her gaze toward the sleeping baby. His jaw slowly tightened. 10 years earlier, he had chosen to walk away from Ethan Caldwell. But as he looked at the tiny child whose heartbeat had survived a mountain blizzard, he understood one undeniable truth. This time, walking away was no longer an option. 3 days later, Ethan Caldwell poured himself a glass of 25-year-old whiskey while the morning financial report played silently across the television mounted inside his penthouse office. Outside, Manhattan glittered beneath a clear winter sky. Inside, there was no trace of the blizzard he had left behind. No sign that a woman had nearly frozen to death because of him. He checked his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window, adjusted his tailored suit, and smiled. "It's over," he murmured to himself. In his mind, Claire Donovan had become another problem erased. No witnesses, no phone, no evidence. By the time spring arrived, everyone would simply assume she had disappeared during the storm. Even the unborn child would be remembered as a tragic accident. His assistant interrupted the silence with a gentle knock. "Sir, Channel 7 is requesting a comment." Ethan barely looked up from the documents on his desk. "About what?" "A survival story." She hesitated. A pregnant woman was reportedly rescued after giving birth during the mountain blizzard. Ethan's hand froze around the whiskey glass. "What did you say?" The assistant placed a tablet on his desk. Grainy helicopter footage filled the screen. Ambulances, police vehicles, rescue crews, reporters standing beside the very highway Ethan had driven 3 nights earlier. The headline stretched across the bottom of the broadcast. "Mother gives birth alone during deadly snowstorm. Mysterious truck driver saves 2 lives." Ethan leaned closer. The footage never showed Claire's face. Hospital officials had protected her identity. But investigators confirmed one disturbing detail. Tire tracks belonging to a luxury vehicle had been discovered near the scene before disappearing down the mountain. Ethan muted the television. His heartbeat accelerated for the first time in years. "Find out who survived," he ordered. Within an hour, 3 private investigators were making calls across the state. Meanwhile, detectives reviewing highway traffic cameras noticed something unusual. At 9:42 p.m., a black Rolls-Royce entered the mountain pass. At 10:18 p.m., the same vehicle exited alone. No passenger. Investigators requested additional recordings from nearby toll stations. Another team recovered faint tire impressions buried beneath fresh snow near the overlook. The storm had hidden many things, but not everything. Hundreds of miles away, inside a quiet hospital room, Claire watched sunlight dance across her daughter's tiny fingers. She had chosen the name Grace because surviving that night felt less like luck and more like something heaven had refused to surrender. Logan stood near the window reading messages on his phone. His security director had sent a confidential report only minutes earlier. Caldwell Holdings had already begun quietly contacting local authorities, offering donations, legal assistance, and generous community support after the storm. Logan recognized the strategy immediately. Ethan wasn't showing compassion. He was buying silence before anyone knew what questions to ask. Logan deleted the message and looked toward Claire. "Has anyone outside the hospital contacted you?" Claire slowly shook her head. "No." "Good." His voice remained calm, but his expression hardened. "Keep it that way for now." Claire sensed the change in him. "You think he's looking for us?" Logan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the bassinet where little Grace slept peacefully beneath a knitted blanket donated by one of the nurses. He watched the baby's tiny chest rise and fall before speaking. "Men like Ethan don't fear losing people." He paused. "They fear surviving witnesses." At that exact moment, Ethan's lead investigator called with the first breakthrough. A hospital employee had quietly confirmed that an unidentified mother and newborn had been admitted on the night of the storm, and that the admission paperwork listed one emergency contact: Logan Hayes. Ethan stared at the name on his phone, and the color slowly drained from his face. The one man whose life he had tried to destroy 10 years earlier had just stepped back into his world, and this time, he wasn't arriving empty-handed. 6 months later, the first camera flashed before Claire Donovan even stepped out of the car. The sharp burst of white light reflected across the glass towers of Caldwell Holdings, where hundreds of shareholders, executives, and financial reporters had gathered for the company's annual investor conference. No one recognized the elegant blonde woman sitting quietly inside the black luxury SUV. To the world, Claire Donovan had disappeared in a snowstorm. Some believed she had died. Others assumed she had simply run away. Ethan Caldwell had done nothing to correct either rumor. He preferred silence. Silence couldn't testify. Inside the conference hall, Ethan stood confidently beneath a massive LED screen displaying soaring profit charts. Applause filled the room as he adjusted his tailored navy suit and smiled for the cameras. "This has been another record-breaking year," he announced. "Our company continues to grow because we make difficult decisions without hesitation." The audience applauded again. Directors nodded with admiration. Investors checked rising stock prices on their phones. Everything appeared exactly as Ethan had planned. Then every conversation stopped. The ballroom doors opened slowly. A young woman in an ivory-colored coat walked inside with calm, measured steps. Her blonde hair rested neatly across her shoulders. Her expression carried neither anger nor fear, only quiet certainty. Behind her walked Logan Hayes. The room immediately erupted into whispers. Nearly everyone recognized the billionaire founder of Hayes Global Logistics. His appearance alone was enough to surprise the board. But it wasn't Logan who captured their attention. It was the woman walking beside him. Ethan's smile disappeared before he realized it. The color drained from his face as though every drop of blood had suddenly abandoned him. His fingers tightened around the podium. "Impossible," he whispered beneath his breath. Claire stopped only a few feet from the stage and looked directly into Ethan's eyes. Neither of them spoke. For several endless seconds, the ballroom fell completely silent except for the faint clicking of camera shutters. Ethan searched her face as though staring at a ghost. He remembered leaving her surrounded by snow. He remembered driving away. He remembered convincing himself that winter had erased every mistake. Yet here she stood, alive, strong, beautiful, beside the one man he had feared seeing again. Logan finally broke the silence. "Good afternoon, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan forced a thin smile. "Mr. Hayes, I wasn't expecting you." "I know." Logan's voice remained calm. Surprises tend to arrive without invitations. Nervous laughter rippled through the audience before fading almost instantly. Ethan stepped away from the podium. "This is a private shareholders meeting." Logan reached into his jacket and handed a sealed envelope to the company's legal counsel sitting in the front row. "Not anymore." The attorney opened it, scanned the first page, and looked up in disbelief. "These are formal requests for emergency review by the board, accompanied by sworn witness statements and newly submitted evidence." Every executive in the room exchanged uneasy glances. Ethan's heartbeat hammered inside his chest. Claire still hadn't spoken a single word. She simply reached into her handbag and removed a tiny knitted baby hat, the same one Grace had worn on the night she was born. She held it gently in both hands before placing it on the empty conference table directly in front of Ethan. The simple piece of fabric carried more weight than any speech ever could. Ethan stared at it without blinking. His breathing became shallow. He understood immediately what it meant. Winter had not buried the evidence. It had protected it until the right moment. Logan stepped beside Claire and looked across the silent ballroom. "Today isn't about revenge," he said evenly. "It's about giving the truth a microphone." And somewhere near the back of the room, an investigative journalist quietly pressed the record button before anyone realized history was about to change. The first piece of evidence appeared without a single word being spoken. Logan Hayes nodded once toward the legal counsel, and the massive LED screen behind Ethan Caldwell flickered. The company's financial presentation vanished. In its place appeared a timestamp. December 18th, 10:07 p.m. Mountain Highway 41. A grainy highway surveillance video filled the room. Ethan's black Rolls-Royce entered the frame, climbing toward the isolated overlook where Claire had been abandoned. The room remained silent. Then another clip appeared. 10:18 p.m. The same vehicle descended the mountain. One person inside. No passenger. A murmur swept through the shareholders. Ethan stepped toward the screen. "This proves nothing." His voice sounded calm, but a thin line of sweat had already formed near his temple. Logan didn't respond. He simply raised one finger. The second layer began. A state investigator walked into the ballroom carrying a sealed evidence container. Every eye followed him. He placed several enlarged photographs onto the conference table. Tire impressions recovered beneath compacted snow. High-resolution comparisons. Digital overlays. Every groove matched the custom winter tires installed exclusively on Ethan's Rolls-Royce less than 2 weeks before the storm. Ethan's attorney stood immediately. "Circumstantial." The investigator calmly nodded. "By itself, yes." He opened another folder. "Not anymore." A GPS specialist connected a laptop to the display. Colored lines traced Ethan's route across the mountains on the night Claire disappeared. The luxury vehicle had stopped for exactly 11 minutes at the overlook before driving away. There had been no emergency call, no attempt to contact police, no request for medical assistance. The silence inside the ballroom became almost unbearable. Claire never looked at the screen. She looked only at Ethan. She wanted him to remember her face, not the snow, not the headlines. Her face. Then came the fourth piece. The emergency physician from Pine Valley Medical Center took the witness stand prepared beside the stage. When Ms. Donovan arrived, he testified. Her core body temperature was critically low. Both mother and infant were within minutes of fatal hypothermia. Had Mr. Hayes arrived even slightly later, neither patient would likely have survived. Cameras flashed continuously. Reporters stopped typing and simply stared. Ethan swallowed hard. This is emotional theater. Logan finally spoke. No. His voice carried effortlessly across the room. The theater ended the night you drove away. Another figure entered through the ballroom doors. A snowplow operator employed by the county highway department. He removed his cap before speaking. I passed that overlook about 20 minutes after the storm got worse. I saw a woman waving beside a black Rolls-Royce. I couldn't stop because the road behind me was already icing over. He pointed directly toward Ethan. I also saw the driver pull away while she was still standing outside. Ethan's breathing grew uneven. His attorney whispered urgently into his ear, but the words barely registered. Logan nodded one final time. The ballroom lights dimmed. Claire reached into her handbag and quietly removed a small digital voice recorder. I carried this every day after Ethan started changing, she said softly. It was the first time anyone had heard her speak since entering the room. She pressed play. Static crackled for a brief second. Then Ethan's unmistakable voice filled the silent hall. You'll only slow me down now. No one moved. No one breathed. The recording lasted less than 5 seconds, yet it shattered everything Ethan had spent years building. The investors lowered their eyes. Board members slowly pushed their chairs away from the table. Even Ethan's own attorney closed the case file in front of him. At that moment, Ethan Caldwell finally understood a truth wealth had hidden from him for too long. Lies can outrun people. They can even outrun winter. But they never outrun the truth forever. 1 year later, the first snow of winter drifted quietly across the same mountains where Claire Donovan had once believed her story would end. The highway looked different now. The guardrail had been replaced. A small emergency call station stood near the overlook. Passing drivers never knew why it had been installed. They simply pressed forward, unaware that one frozen night had rewritten 3 lives forever. Ethan Caldwell no longer stood behind polished podiums or smiled beneath flashing cameras. His board of directors had voted unanimously to remove him within 48 hours of the shareholder meeting. Criminal charges followed. Civil lawsuits multiplied. Investors abandoned him. Business magazines that once celebrated his ambition now used his photograph beside headlines about greed, arrogance, and irreversible failure. The empire he had spent decades building collapsed far faster than it had risen. Yet the greatest punishment was never financial. Every morning, he woke knowing he had destroyed his own future the moment he chose convenience over compassion. Meanwhile, Hayes Global Logistics announced a nationwide foundation dedicated to emergency roadside assistance for stranded families during severe winter storms. Hundreds of emergency shelters were funded across remote highways. Every shelter carried the same simple inscription beneath its entrance. No one should face winter alone. Logan Hayes refused every interview asking why he had created the program. Some stories belong to the people who survived them, was the only answer he ever gave. Claire rarely appeared in public. She never sought fame, revenge, or sympathy. She spent most mornings reading beside a large window while little Grace played across the wooden floor surrounded by toy trucks Logan insisted on bringing home after every business trip. Grace had inherited Claire's bright blue eyes and Logan's quiet determination, though no one ever mentioned the second part aloud. Logan never tried to replace anyone. He simply became the steady presence both mother and daughter had once believed no longer existed. One snowy afternoon, the 3 of them returned to the mountain overlook together. The wind was gentle this time. Grace laughed as she caught snowflakes inside tiny woolen mittens. Claire stood silently beside the roadside barrier, staring across the endless white valley. She could still remember the fear. The cold. The silence. She closed her eyes for a moment before feeling a warm hand slip gently into hers. Logan didn't speak. He didn't need to. Some promises were stronger when left unspoken. Claire looked down at Grace, building a tiny snowman with determined little hands. A smile slowly replaced the sadness she had carried for so long. "She'll never remember that night," Claire whispered. Logan watched Grace carefully place a small knitted hat on top of the snowman. It was the same baby hat Claire had placed on Ethan's conference table months earlier. "No," Logan answered softly. "She'll remember what came after." Claire nodded. That was enough. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, golden lights spread across the snow, transforming the frozen landscape into something almost beautiful. The place that had once witnessed betrayal now witnessed peace. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive wearing a judge's robe. Sometimes it arrives behind the wheel of an old truck, carrying nothing more than courage, compassion, and the willingness to stop when everyone else keeps driving. Claire lifted Grace into her arms, and together they walked back toward the waiting truck. 3 sets of footprints stretched across the fresh snow instead of one. The wind slowly covered the old tracks forever, but it never touched the new ones. Because some men lose everything they own just to discover what a woman's dignity was worth. Others stop for a stranger on the coldest night of the year and find the family they never knew they were waiting for.